CMV, if Great Britain not giving the 13 U.S. colonies representation in Parliament was so unfair, it's not fair that Guam/Puerto Rico/all the U.S. territories don't get representation in Congress. The historical objection is taxation without representation, and the U.S. territories do not pay federal income tax. So for Puerto Rico and Guam, there are trade-offs about statehood, and PR doesn't have an overwhelming consensus for statehood. Where it's most unfair is Washington, D.C., whose residents are subject to taxation, and where Congress controls parts of its administration. D.C. residents are overwhelmingly in favor of statehood. There are pros and cons to it. The biggest difference is that U.S. territories don't pay federal taxes, they just pay taxes to their local governments. So they have less direct influence over national policy, but they also don't have to adhere to it in the same ways that states do. So they can make laws that are uniquely specific to being a territory. For example, though English is mandatory, they still primarily use Spanish. This would put them at a significant disadvantage when it comes to following national policy, which will dramatically affect their unique culture. So being a territory means you have the full protection of the US without necessarily needing to be a part of the process. I mean, one prime example of this is Hawaii. While they still maintain a lot of their unique Hawaiian heritage, it's been completely Americanized. A place like Puerto Rico would effectively experience gentrification. Puerto Rican here. It seems there is a lot of misinformation in these comments, so I'll try to do my best in answering your doubts. This means that I'm not going to try to change your view per se. I'm just informing you. Most importantly, my answer is specifically grounded in Puerto Rico, so Guam's or any other territory's situation might not be the same. Without further ado, I'll begin. First, we can't talk about representation without talking about taxation. Although it's true that PR does not pay federal income tax, we can look at its net federal expenditures to see that this does not mean that the federal government doesn't receive anything from PR. In 2016, the net federal expenditures for PR show that PR received a net value of $620 million from the federal government. A figure that was calculated by subtracting $3.48 billion in federal tax contributions made by PR from $4.1 billion in federal expenditures to PR. The citizens do pay Social Security and Medicare taxes at the same rates as do people in the states. Also, Puerto Rico is excluded from some major federal expenditure programs, e.g., the Earned Income Tax Credit, and is treated less favorably than states in some others, e.g. Medicare. Further, Puerto Rico is virtually excluded from federal procurement and employment expenditures. Sustainability, the welfare state. The net federal expenditure shows that Puerto Rico takes more than it gives to the U.S. government, right? Well, yes, it does. The unfortunate reality is that PR is not alone. Rather, most U.S. states receive more federal dollars than they contribute to taxes, 37 out of 50 states. Furthermore, in 2004 and 2010, 18 U.S. states take more per capita from the U.S. federal government than Puerto Rico, with Alaska, New Mexico, Virginia, Alabama, D.C., Wyoming, Kentucky, and others being among those 18 states. Federal spending is determined by many factors, but one of these is to aid low-income parts of the country. By that criterion, Puerto Rico would be right at the top, which it is not. However, another factor is the political power of a state's representatives in Washington, and although it is true that PR does have representation, that representation is the resident commissioner, this a single person representing PR at the federal level. To my knowledge, commissioners function in every respect as a member of Congress, except that they are denied a vote on the final disposition of legislation on the House floor. Final thoughts. For me, the various exclusions from federal expenditures appear to more than balance the privilege of not paying personal and corporate taxes. Despite this, it does not balance the lack of representation. Greater representation at a federal level, achieved by statehood, might result in a more equal ground and relationship with the other states, even if it comes at the cost of paying a bit more in taxes. You are correct that people of the territories pay taxes, although they don't pay the federal income tax that people in the states do. They do all have one non-voting representative in Congress. D.C. is unique in that its citizens pay federal income tax but also get to help select the president. On paper, the taxation without representation situation is correct. However, aside from D.C., most territorial citizens are happy, or at least satisfied, with the current situation. If any of them decided to pursue statehood or independence, and there was a clear Democratic majority, then the U.S. government would likely comply. The biggest difference between the 13 colonies and current U.S. territories is that the territories are not second-class states. Each territory operates largely as any other U.S. states does. The 13 colonies, however, were treated as subservient regions with fewer rights than the mainland of Britain. Oof. For starters, accepting no taxation without representation as our guiding principle limits our ability to understand power dynamics between modern-day colonies and the U.S. For example, while Puerto Ricans do not pay federal income tax, we do pay other forms of federal taxes. And if that were the deciding factor, strict adherence to no taxation, then we would be entitled to representation, especially when national policies, like climate inaction, negatively affect the very prospect of life on islands. However, my main beef with your view is that it excludes other ways in which a colonial relationship maims colonies other than not having representation. One example is that we are subjected to U.S. markets almost exclusively. Virtually all entertainment, tech, fast food franchises, mega stores, online services, biomedicine, and previously government-run essential services are owned by corporations native to the U.S. Meaning that with each year more and more money is siphoned from PR to the corporate U.S., slowly but surely impoverishing the local population since that money doesn't circulate back. And while corporate wealth accretion is not a problem unique to the colonies, unlike the rest of the U.S., we can't do anything about it. Unique to the colonies, well, Native Americans can also attest, is a history of abuse of local populations, forced sterilization, FBI cover-ups, and a desecration of natural resources, defoliating chemicals tested on El Yunque rainforest, military drill bombings on coastal environments. That points out the asymmetrical nature of colonial relations. People that say that colonies just don't want to change the status quo are probably ignorant of the insurrection history of colonies, specifically Puerto Rico, and of how the U.S. and its local accomplices have managed to suppress them through more than a century of state-sponsored violence. See, Uchuado/Jaoya bombings. TLDR. I agree that it isn't a fair relationship, but there's a lot more to it than just taxation. My understanding, at least for Puerto Rico, is that they have voted to reject statehood themselves, which is why they do not have representation. They do not want representation at this time. I can't say the same for Guam because I do not know their situation.